The WNBA didn't wake up one morning and suddenly lose its sponsors. There was no press release, no emergency announcement, no headlines screaming collapse. What happened was much quieter and far more dangerous. Phones stopped ringing. Emails slowed down. Meetings that used to be automatic were suddenly pushed to the next quarter. Brands that were once eager to attach themselves to the future of women's basketball began using a new phrase behind closed doors: "Let's wait and see." Because the league didn't just mishandle a moment. They mishandled the moment. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the WNBA like a normal rookie. She arrived as a walking economy, a ratings machine, a cultural event that crossed sports, media, and generational lines. She brought casual fans. She brought non-basketball fans. She brought people who had never watched a single WNBA game and suddenly cared deeply. And instead of protecting that moment, instead of amplifying it, instead of building around it, the league hesitated. That hesitation sent a signal. Not to fans, but to the people who actually decide where the money goes. Sponsors don't react to box scores. They react to momentum, optics, and power dynamics. And what they watched unfold around Caitlin Clark raised a question no league ever once whispered about it. Does this organization even understand what it has? While fans argued on social media, something far more serious was happening out of public view. Executives were reassessing risk. Brand managers were re-evaluating alignment. And league leadership was quietly realizing that the biggest star they had ever produced was becoming the center of a conversation they could no longer control. This isn't a story about Caitlin Clark wanting out. It's not about betrayal. It's not about rebellion. It's about a league facing its own reflection and realizing too late that the system it built was never designed to handle a star this big. And once that realization hits, panic doesn't look loud. It looks like silence. From the moment Caitlin Clark's name was called, the WNBA changed, whether it wanted to or not. Viewership surged. Ticket prices spiked. Arenas that once struggled to fill lower bowls suddenly sold standing room only. Merchandise flew off shelves. Broadcasts pulled numbers the league had chased for decades. Even road games became events. Wherever she played, attendance followed. But here's the part people misunderstand. Caitlin Clark wasn't just popular. She was disruptive. She disrupted the league's carefully balanced ecosystem, one built around parity, shared visibility, and collective branding. The WNBA had always marketed itself as a league first, stars second. That approach worked when no single player overshadowed the shield. Caitlin shattered that balance overnight. Suddenly, one player was bigger than the messaging, bigger than the narratives, bigger than the traditional gatekeepers who decide how attention gets distributed. And that kind of power doesn't just excite leagues, it scared them. Because once fans tune in for one person, control starts slipping. Every foul she absorbed became a clip. Every hard hit turned into a debate. Every missed call sparked outrage. And while some dismissed it as rookie treatment or just physical play, sponsors saw something very different. They saw narrative. Is this environment stable enough for a long-term brand partnership? That internal divide slowed everything down. Marketing pushes felt cautious. Messaging felt muted. Opportunities that should have been automatic were suddenly debated. And in the corporate world, hesitation is a red flag. Sponsors don't like uncertainty, else their money might work better. Fans watch highlights. Sponsors watch patterns. That's the disconnect most people miss when they talk about sponsor exits or brand panic. Corporations don't care about viral clips in isolation. They care about trajectories. They care about where a moment is heading, and whether it's being handled with intention or improvisation. When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, sponsors weren't just watching her. They were watching how the league responded to her. Because to above all else, stability. At first, the numbers were intoxicating. Ratings surged. Sellouts followed. Merchandise demand shattered projections. On paper, this looked like the breakthrough sponsors had been promised for years. Internally, marketing decks lit up. Executives smiled. The future finally felt real. But then the questions started. Why does the league's biggest draw look exposed night after night? Why does the conversation keep drifting toward physical targeting instead of celebration? Why does fan outrage feel louder than official messaging? To fans, this was passion. No visible effort to shift the narrative away from conflict and toward overshadowing performance. And most importantly, they noticed how little the league seemed willing to step in and recalibrate the narrative. That's when internal brand conversations began to change. Not how do we lean into this, but how exposed does this make us? From a sponsor's perspective, attaching to a star means attaching to the league's ability to manage attention responsibly. And when that ability looks uncertain, brands do what they always do. They pause. They don't cancel contracts overnight. That would draw attention. Instead, they delay renewals. They reclassify budgets. They quietly move star-driven campaigns into evaluation mode. The money doesn't disappear. It waits. And waiting is a warning. What made the situation even more alarming was how unnecessary it felt. Sponsors could see the opportunity just as clearly as fans. They understood Caitlin Clark's pull. They understood the crossover appeal. They understood that moments like this don't come often. Which made one question impossible to ignore. If the league can't confidently stand behind its biggest moment ever, what happens when the spotlight gets even brighter? Because Caitlin Clark wasn't the endgame. She was the beginning. And sponsors could sense that leadership was reacting instead of leading. That realization didn't cause outrage. It caused recalibration. Budgets were reassessed. Campaigns were diversified. And some brands began quietly exploring parallel opportunities, not as replacements, but as hedges. Just in case. Just in case the league never fully embraced what it had unleashed. And once sponsors start hedging their bets, momentum becomes fragile. Because in modern sports, belief is currency. And belief, once shaken, doesn't return easily. And that hesitation was about to collide with another uncomfortable reality, one the league could no longer ignore. Because while sponsors were watching the league hesitate, they were also watching what didn't happen next. And that absence spoke volumes. Momentum is fragile. In sports, attention alone isn't enough, you have to capture it. You have to make deliberate, aggressive decisions about how that attention is shaped, where it's directed, and what story it tells the world. That's where things began to unravel. Caitlin Clark wasn't lacking buzz. She was drowning in it. Every game produced viral clips. Every road trip felt like an event. Her presence alone transformed arenas that had felt routine just months earlier. And yet, the league's official response felt restrained. Not absent. Not negligent. Just noticeably cautious. To casual fans, this was easy to overlook. But to people in marketing, especially sports marketing, it stood out immediately. There was no aggressive recalibration. No bold repositioning of league identity around the moment. No clear signal that the WNBA was prepared to fully embrace the reality that one player had dramatically altered its visibility. Instead, the messaging remained balanced, careful, and almost conservative. That restraint created a strange disconnect. On one side, organic engagement exploded. Social platforms were flooded with Caitlin Clark content from fans, media outlets, and third-party creators. Clips pulled millions of views. Conversations spilt far beyond traditional basketball circles. People who had never followed the WNBA were suddenly invested. On the other side, the league's official channels felt steady, measured, business as usual. That mismatch raised eyebrows. Because leagues rarely get moments like this. And when they do, the playbook is clear. Amplify, consolidate, and own the narrative before someone else does. But here, it felt like hesitation. Internally, this is where fear often creeps in. Fear of overexposure. Fear of backlash. Fear of alienating existing players or partners. Fear of favoritism accusations. And while those concerns are understandable, they come at a cost. Because hesitation during a breakout moment sends a signal, not just to fans, but to investors and sponsors watching closely. It signals uncertainty. It signals internal disagreement. And worst of all, it suggests leadership may not fully understand what the moment represents. Sponsors noticed the freeze. They noticed that the league didn't position Caitlin Clark as a clear gateway for new audiences. They noticed the absence of decisive, star-forward storytelling. And they noticed that much of the momentum was being carried by outside media, not by the league itself. That's not what confidence looks like. From a brand's perspective, the league had something priceless in its hands, a cultural crossover moment, and seemed unsure how firmly to hold it. That uncertainty made sponsors uneasy, because star-driven growth depends on clarity. Clarity of vision. Clarity of messaging. Clarity of intent. Without that clarity, brands are left guessing. And when brands guess, they pull back, not because interest disappears, but because certainty does. The most telling part wasn't what the league said. It was what it didn't say. There was no definitive reframing of the season around Caitlin's presence. No bold declaration of a new era. No public acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. Instead, the moment drifted. And when moments drift, others step in to shape them. The narrative around Caitlin Clark began forming without league guidance, driven by commentators, fans, and online discourse. Some celebratory, some critical, some volatile. But almost all of it is uncontrolled. For sponsors, that's a nightmare scenario. Brands don't invest in volatility. They invest in stories they trust to remain consistent. And the longer the league stayed quiet, the more fragmented the narrative became. That fragmentation didn't kill momentum, but it cracked it. And once a crack forms, money starts looking for exits. Not loud exits. Smart ones. Because sponsors don't leave when things go wrong. They leave when they sense leadership doesn't know how to make things go right. That realization set the stage for the most misunderstood phase of this entire saga. The money didn't vanish. It moved. When people say sponsors are leaving, they imagine dramatic announcements, public exits, cancelled deals, headlines. That's not how real money behaves. Real money moves quietly. What happened around the WNBA wasn't a mass exodus. It was something more dangerous, a redistribution. Budgets didn't disappear. They were repositioned. Behind closed doors, marketing executives changed their language. Instead of committing long-term dollars to league-wide initiatives, they began breaking investments into smaller, more flexible segments. Instead of league-centric campaigns, they explored star-adjacent or sport-adjacent opportunities. Not because Caitlin Clark scared them, but because uncertainty did. From a corporate standpoint, this wasn't panic. It was risk management. The league's hesitation created an environment where brands couldn't confidently forecast how the Caitlin Clark moment would evolve. And when forecasts become unclear, financial officers tighten control. Renewals were delayed. Expansions were tabled. Future-facing campaigns were labeled optional. That's the first stage of withdrawal. It doesn't appear in headlines. It appears in spreadsheets. The most revealing move wasn't brands pulling out. It was brands hedging. They wanted exposure to Caitlin's audience without tying themselves too tightly to league-level uncertainty. So they diversified. Some shifted spending toward individual activations. Others explored parallel women's sports properties. A few quietly tested campaigns outside the WNBA ecosystem altogether. None of it was announced. None of it was framed as dissatisfaction. It was framed as strategy. But strategy speaks volumes. When a league feels confident and aligned, brands consolidate. They go all in. They deepen partnerships. They unify messaging. When a league feels uncertain, brands spread out. They protect the downside. They keep options open. That's what happened here. And the league felt it. Even if it wasn't acknowledged publicly, the internal tone shifted. Conversations became cautious. Growth projections softened. The buzz remained, but it felt conditional. Conditional on Caitlin Clark continuing to perform. Conditional on messaging stabilizing. Conditional on controversy not escalating. And here's the uncomfortable truth. None of those conditions should have existed. This was supposed to be the easy part. The hard work, building awareness, capturing attention, generating demand, had already been done. Caitlin Clark delivered that on a scale no marketing department could manufacture. All the league had to do was harness it. Instead, brands sensed hesitation and adapted. And adaptation spreads. Once a few sponsors shift strategy, others notice. Not because they're copying, but because they're comparing. They start asking, what do they see that we don't? That question alone can stall momentum. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about growth. It's about caution. About protecting brand equity. About avoiding unresolved alignment. And unresolved moments don't attract bold investment. They attract wait-and-see behavior. That's when the stakes quietly rose. Because while fans celebrated sellout arenas and viral highlights, the financial ecosystem beneath was becoming more fragile. Not broken, just less committed. And that fragility mattered for one reason above all else. It put pressure on leadership. Because when money stops moving confidently, accountability follows. And that pressure would soon expose a deeper issue. One that extended beyond Caitlin Clark, beyond sponsorships, and straight into the core of league governance. Because now the problem wasn't just marketing. It was control. Adam Silver never had to say Caitlin Clark's name for her to become his problem. Because this was never about one player. It was about what happens when a league built on control produces a star that operates outside it. The WNBA exists in a unique position. Technically independent, but structurally intertwined with the NBA. Financially supported. Strategically guided. Philosophically influenced. For years, that relationship worked because the league never produced a figure capable of destabilizing the balance. Caitlin Clark changed that. Stars are manageable when they grow within the system. When leagues mold them, market them, and define the limits of their visibility. That's how control is maintained. That's how messaging stays clean. But Caitlin didn't rise that way. She arrived fully formed, with a built-in. The WNBA didn't wake up one morning and lose its sponsors. There was no press release, no emergency announcement, no headlines screaming collapse. What happened was quieter than that, and far more dangerous. Phones stopped ringing. Emails slowed down. Meetings that were once automatic suddenly got pushed to next quarter. Brands that were once eager to attach themselves to the future of women's basketball began using a new phrase behind closed doors: let's wait and see. Because the league didn't just mishandle a moment. They mishandled the moment. Caitlin Clark didn't enter the WNBA like a normal rookie. She arrived as a walking economy, a ratings machine, and a cultural event that crossed sports, media, and generational lines. She brought casual fans. She brought non-basketball fans. She brought people who had never watched a single WNBA game and suddenly cared deeply. And instead of protecting that moment, instead of amplifying it, instead of building around it, the league hesitated. That hesitation sent a signal, not to fans, but to the people who actually decide where the money goes. Sponsors don't react to box scores. They react to momentum, optics, and power dynamics. And what they saw unfold around Caitlin Clark raised a question no league ever once whispered about it. Does this organization even understand what it has? Because while fans were arguing on social media, something far more serious was happening out of public view. Executives were reassessing risk. Brand managers were re-evaluating alignment. And league leadership was quietly realizing that the biggest star they'd ever had was becoming the center of a conversation they could no longer control. This isn't a story about Caitlin Clark wanting out. It's not about betrayal. It's not about rebellion. It's about a league facing its own reflection and realizing too late that the system it built was never designed to handle a star this big. And once that realization hits, panic doesn't look loud. It looks like silence. From the moment Caitlin Clark's name was called, the WNBA changed, whether it wanted to or not. Viewership surged. Ticket prices spiked. Arenas that had struggled to fill lower bowls were suddenly selling standing room. Merchandise flew off shelves. Broadcasts pulled in numbers the league had chased for decades. Even road games turned into events. Wherever she played, attendance followed. But here's the part people misunderstand. Caitlin Clark wasn't just popular. She was disruptive. She disrupted the league's carefully balanced ecosystem, one built around parity, shared visibility, and collective branding. The WNBA had always promoted itself as a league first, stars second. That philosophy worked when no single player overshadowed the shield. Caitlin shattered that balance overnight. Suddenly, one player was bigger than the messaging, bigger than the narratives, and bigger than the usual gatekeepers who decide how attention gets distributed. And that kind of power doesn't just excite leagues. It creates anxiety. She arrived with her own fan base, with national recognition, with leverage that existed before the league ever had a chance to define her. And that's where the anxiety started. Because once a player's influence outpaces the league's infrastructure, authority becomes delicate. Every decision feels amplified. Every misstep feels bigger. Every attempt at restraint risks backfiring. From the outside, this looked like normal growing pains. From the inside, it felt like a governance test. The NBA has dealt with transcendent stars before, but always on its own terms. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Steph Curry. Each one emerged inside a system built to monetize and protect them. The NBA didn't hesitate. It adapted instantly. The WNBA, by contrast, hesitated. Not because it didn't recognize Caitlin's value, but because embracing her fully meant rewriting rules that had kept the league stable. A single player becoming the central economic driver changes everything. It affects bargaining power. It affects internal politics. It affects how other players view equity. And for a league still navigating growth, that kind of imbalance is unsettling. That's the unspoken problem Adam Silver represents in this story. Not resistance, but caution. Because the moment Caitlin Clark became bigger than the league's messaging, she became bigger than its ability to quietly manage outcomes. And leagues don't like uncertainty, especially when they are still building legitimacy. The fear wasn't that Caitlin would leave. The fear was that she wouldn't need permission. That her influence would continue expanding regardless of league strategy. That sponsors would follow her gravity instead of official channels. That the power dynamic would shift permanently. And when that happens, centralized control weakens for governance bodies. That's the nightmare scenario. So decisions slowed. Messaging softened. Authority leaned conservative. The instinct wasn't to suppress, it was to contain. But containment doesn't work on momentum. The more the league tried to keep everything balanced, the more unbalanced the situation became. Caitlin's presence distorted normal operations simply by existing. Every game she played rewrote metrics. Every road appearance highlighted disparities. Every viral moment made the gap between organic demand and official response more obvious. And sponsors saw that gap clearly. They saw a league navigating fear instead of confidence. A league protecting structure instead of seizing opportunity. A league unsure whether it wanted the future that had arrived at its doorstep. That uncertainty didn't just affect marketing. It affected trust. Because when brands sense a league is uncomfortable with its own breakout star, they start questioning long-term alignment. They start asking whether leadership is prepared for scale, or whether it will resist it. And that question is deadly. Modern sports economics don't reward restraint. They reward momentum management. Adam Silver's nightmare wasn't Caitlin Clark becoming too big. It was the realization that the system surrounding her wasn't ready. And once that realization sets in, everything downstream starts to wobble. Sponsors hesitate. Ownership groups question strategy. Internal divisions deepen. And the spotlight only gets brighter. Because the next phase of this story wasn't happening in boardrooms. It was happening in plain sight. And other leagues were watching closely, and learning exactly what not to do. Some ownership groups worried that overemphasizing Caitlin Clark would make the league vulnerable, too dependent on one figure. Others argued the opposite, that not embracing her fully was the real risk. That disagreement stalled decisive action. Every proposal came with resistance. Every idea sparked concern. And instead of clarity, the league drifted further into cautious compromise, the kind that satisfies no one and solves nothing. Meanwhile, sponsors were still watching. They could sense the tension even without direct access. Deals slowed. Negotiations became more complex. Language shifted from expansion to evaluation. And ownership groups felt that pressure immediately, because when sponsorship momentum slows, franchises feel it fast. Budgets tighten. Projections get revised. Long-term plans become conservative. And suddenly, the excitement of a breakout star is replaced by anxiety about sustainability. That's when panic sets in. Not loud panic, but strategic panic. Owners began quietly questioning leadership. Not publicly, but internally. Was the league moving fast enough? Was it unified? Did it understand the moment it was living in? Those questions didn't have easy answers. And Caitlin Clark, at the center of it all, remained silent. She didn't lobby. She didn't complain. She didn't make demands, which paradoxically made things worse, because silence removes excuses. Without controversy coming from her side, the spotlight stayed where it belonged, on the league's response, or lack of one. Inside ownership circles, another fear began to surface. What if Caitlin didn't need the league as much as the league needed her? What if her influence continued to grow independently through media, culture, and crossover appeal, while the league struggled to keep up? That possibility unsettled people. Leagues are built on the assumption that stars rise within them, not alongside them. When that assumption breaks, governance becomes fragile. Now ownership groups were staring at a future where their most valuable asset might also be their least controllable variable. That's not a comfortable place to be, especially when the spotlight isn't dimming. It's intensifying. Because the next phase of this story wasn't about owners arguing in boardrooms. It was about how Caitlin Clark's silence started to speak louder than any statement ever could. Caitlin Clark never demanded anything. That's the part that unsettled people the most. In an era where stars leverage moments instantly, issuing statements, pushing narratives, reshaping public opinion in real time, Caitlin did the opposite. She played. She showed up. She answered questions politely. Then she went back to work. No cryptic posts. No public frustration. No subtle shots. Just silence. And that silence became impossible to ignore. Because when a player with her level of attention chooses not to speak, it removes the usual distractions. There's no controversy to blame. No attitude to critique. No sound bite to twist. All that's left is the environment around her. And the environment wasn't flattering. Every game she played intensified the contrast. The crowds were louder. The cameras followed her constantly. Ratings continued to climb. The demand didn't cool, it accelerated. Yet the league's posture remained cautious. To fans, Caitlin's silence looked like professionalism. To sponsors, it looked like restraint. To ownership, it looked like leverage. Because silence, when backed by numbers, is power. She didn't need to say she was the league's biggest draw. The data said it for her. She didn't need to complain about treatment. The footage spoke for itself. She didn't need to push narratives. The audience had already chosen her. And that made leadership uncomfortable, because silence doesn't negotiate. It doesn't warn. It doesn't compromise. It just waits. Inside league circles, that waiting felt ominous. Not because Caitlin was plotting something, but because she didn't need to. Her presence alone continued reshaping the ecosystem, without requiring permission. Sponsors noticed this too. They saw a star who didn't stir drama, yet generated massive attention. That's the ideal profile. And they saw a league that seemed unsure how to respond to that kind of clean, organic influence. That imbalance raised a quiet but powerful question. If Caitlin Clark ever decided to redirect her energy, would the league be able to follow her? or would it be left reacting again? That's not a hypothetical brands like to entertain. Because the most dangerous stars aren't the loud ones. They are the ones who don't need noise to move markets. Every week, Caitlyn stayed silent. And every week, the spotlight shifted further away from her behavior and deeper onto league decision-making. Analysts reframed the discussion. Fans stopped arguing about hype and started questioning leadership. The conversation matured, and that maturity was brutal. It stripped away emotional defenses. What remained was a clear-eyed look at cause and effect. Caitlyn Clark delivered unprecedented attention. The league hesitated. Sponsors adjusted. Ownership grew tense. No villains. No conspiracies. Just consequences. That's what made the silence so heavy. It forced everyone to confront the same uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a crisis caused by rebellion or conflict. It was caused by indecision. And indecision is contagious. As like a crossroads story. As if Caitlyn Clark was weighing options. As if this was about escape, defiance, or choosing something else over the WNBA. That was never the truth. This moment was never about Caitlyn leaving the league. It was about whether the league knew how to stand beside her. Stars don't abandon systems when they feel valued. They don't drift when they feel protected. They don't look elsewhere when they feel understood. What they do is respond to environments quietly, instinctively, and without announcements. Caitlyn Clark didn't need to threaten anything. She didn't need leverage plays or dramatic pivots. Her influence had already revealed the only question that mattered. Was the league evolving with her, or asking her to slow down for it? That distinction changes everything. Because what sponsors, executives, and ownership groups were reacting to wasn't the possibility of Caitlyn leaving. It was the realization that the league's framework wasn't built for acceleration. The WNBA had spent years preparing for growth. But growth on paper is different from growth in real time. When momentum hits all at once, it tests every assumption about structure, messaging, and authority. Caitlyn Clark exposed those fault lines simply by existing. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't a standoff. It wasn't a power grab. It was misalignment. A star moving at the speed of culture. A league moving at the speed of policy. And culture always wins. That's why the money moved the way it did. Not out of protest, but out of instinct. Sponsors follow alignment. They follow environments that feel ready, not just hopeful. They weren't betting against the WNBA. They were hedging against hesitation. That's the nuance people miss. The league wasn't being punished. It was being evaluated, in real time, under conditions it had never faced before. And that evaluation didn't come from critics. It came from success. Because Caitlyn Clark didn't expose failure. She exposed unreadiness. And unreadiness is dangerous because it's invisible, until pressure arrives. By the time leadership realized the moment required decisiveness instead of balance, the conversation had already shifted. The league wasn't being asked to recognize Caitlyn anymore. It was being asked whether it could keep up. That's a much harder question. Keeping up requires surrendering some control. It requires trusting momentum instead of regulating it. It requires accepting that stars don't just elevate leagues, they reshape them. Caitlyn Clark wasn't challenging authority. She was redefining relevance. And relevance doesn't wait for consensus. That's why this moment didn't explode. It evolved, quietly, strategically, inevitably. And now the league finds itself standing at a threshold it didn't expect to reach so fast. One where the future isn't hypothetical anymore. It's already happening. The nightmare was never Caitlyn Clark becoming too big. The nightmare was realizing the system around her wasn't ready. And once that realization sets in, there's no going back to business as usual, only forward, or out of the way. This story doesn't end with a scandal. It doesn't end with an announcement. And it doesn't end with Caitlyn Clark walking away from anything. It ends with a realization. The WNBA didn't lose Caitlyn Clark. It didn't lose its fans. It didn't suddenly lose its sponsors. What it almost lost was control of the future. Because Caitlin Clark represents something leagues can't manufacture, regulate, or slow down. She represents cultural momentum. And cultural momentum doesn't ask for permission. This wasn't a collapse. It was a warning. Moments like this don't come twice. Generational stars don't slow down for institutions. Relevance isn't something you protect. It's something you ride, or lose. The league still has time. It still has her. It still has the attention. But time behaves differently once momentum shows up. Caitlin Clark isn't the future of women's basketball. She's the present. And the leagues, brands, and leaders who understand that won't be chasing relevance anymore. They'll already be standing in it. If you want real stories about what's actually happening behind the scenes of basketball, not the press release version, make sure you're subscribed. Because this Caitlin Clark story isn't over. And the next chapter is going to make this one look quiet.